Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here at Trinity Baptist Church in Sherwood Park, and I just want to welcome you to another online study that we've been doing on Tuesday nights here throughout most of the pandemic, really. If you're joining us from the church, welcome to all of you. If you're joining us from elsewhere, special welcome to you as well. Before we get into our study today, just a couple things for you. First of all, can I say, wow, what an absolutely boring Super Bowl yesterday. That was a huge disappointment. And Brady wins again. Anyway, not important, but also wanted to say, wow, it is cold out right now. I can imagine that you're huddled in at home. Not many of us have any good reasons to be outside on a cold winter evening, so hopefully this is going to be a good, refreshing time for you. I am recording this ahead of time, as you can probably guess from the sunlight in the mirror, but I am around tonight when this video goes live, so feel free to comment and interact if you'd like. Some of you like to do that, some of you don't. Even if you just say hello, just to let me know that you're a familiar face who's watching, that's always encouraging. But we are in a study of the New Testament book of First Peter. In fact, if you're not there already, I would encourage you to turn to First Peter to chapter 2. We are actually going to be looking at chapter 2, just kind of a small chunk again. Verses 11 through 17 is the only bit that we're going to look at. Again, that's First Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17. There are issues that are raised in this particular passage about church and state that seem really relevant to us. Of course, there was other circumstances going on here in the letter, but thinking about ourselves, there are churches in our country, including churches, just a church in the Edmonton area, that are making the news for breaking government COVID restrictions. And this particular relevant thing for us, it brings up these larger questions about how we as Christians are to live out the commands that we see in this passage. So maybe that gets you a little bit interested as we get into it. Now, before we get into this particular passage, let's just again review where we've been. If you would back it up a number of weeks, I gave an extensive background info to this particular letter. The first bit of chapter 1, we preached through that. There's a big theme about God's salvation, which is amazing. There's then follow up with that is a little section about how we are to respond to God's salvation. And then last week, we were looking at our central and grounding identity as God's people. You might remember I said, you are a house. That's kind of where we've been. Today, we're actually going to switch gears and kind of go in a different direction in the letter because the letter goes in a different direction. There's a literary switch here from the opening prayer and kind of the opening theological truths now to a shift towards practical exhortations or instructions. The theme also switches from salvation, which I just mentioned was a prominent theme early on in the letter, and now the theme really switches to how to live out our faith in various social groups. So as we look at our passage today, I want us to see that verses 11 and 12 function as a general kind of banner statement for a long section that follows well into chapter 3. Let me read verses 11 and 12. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So as a banner statement, I think that we'll have some fun walking through that in a second, but I just want you to see how that serves as a banner statement. Look at verse 13, where we're told to submit to human authority or to governments. That's going to be our focus today. But if you keep your eyes going later on in the letter, verse 18 talks about how slaves in reverent fear of God need to submit themselves to their masters. Now, don't get too hung up on the slaves thing. We'll talk about that next week and talk it all through. But keep going down into chapter 3 now. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. And then later on in verse 7 of chapter 3, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. And then down at verse 8, finally, all of you be like-minded, and it goes on from there. All of that together is what many scholars over the years have called household codes. And we're going to see, in fact, we actually have seen a household code before. Back in late spring, we walked through the New Testament book of Colossians. You might remember that. And we got to a little place there in Colossians that talked about slaves and husbands and wives. And you see that again in Ephesians. But it's not just limited to the Bible. There's household codes that are written in common kind of Roman Greco literature of the time, Jewish literature of the time as well. So it's not necessarily that these are new instructions. They would have been familiar to people, but the content of the instructions is sometimes a little revealing. So we won't dwell on all of that too much right now. We'll maybe get into a little more of that later. Let's just focus in first here on this banner statement in verses 11 and 12. It starts off by saying, "Dear friends." I love that because, again, Peter, he's an apostle. He could use a loud, booming apostolic voice to kind of demand attention. But here you see him kind of leveling himself. He's appealing on the basis of friendship. He's really humble with it. We'll see that again later on in chapter 5. And you can see what he says. "Dear friends, I urge you." Literally, I exhort you, or I encourage you, or I command you, that kind of a thing. This is the first I statement in the letter. We'll see another one again in chapter 5. So there's a switch. There's been a lot of great theological talk about salvation, as I've already mentioned, but now he's really switching and he's doing this personal appeal to these people. And he labels them as foreigners and exiles. Now, again, we've come across this already. This is the third time that those terms are mentioned in the letter. We saw it in chapter 1 2 different times. And as a reminder to you, this isn't meant to be interpreted as kind of like a allegorical kind of thing about how we're all pilgrims on a journey. This isn't our true home. Now, he's actually appealing to them because they literally are foreigners and exiles. Most likely people who are originally from Rome, but were kicked out of there because of these squabbles between Jews and Christians. And now they're finding themselves in what we now call modern day Turkey, and they are foreigners and exiles. So he's writing to them as such, and because they're that, they're being watched by their neighbors. In fact, one of the commentators I was reading this week, they just have this great quote, and I think it's so true. They just say, "One trait of human nature seems to be that people watch strangers more closely." I mean, isn't that true, right? If you know your neighbors and you know your neighborhood, you see some familiar faces walking by the front window, and it doesn't necessarily catch too much of your attention. But if you see someone that looks a little different, someone you've never seen before, especially if you're in a smaller town or rural setting, if you're in an acreage out here, it kind of catches your attention. And this could even be magnified, and I don't want to take it in too many different directions because it can get kind of heated. But if you live in a place it's kind of mono-ethnic, if you have someone from a different ethnicity who's walking around your neighborhood, sometimes, unfortunately, that causes a lot of attention, and people jump to conclusions. It's no good at all. That also happens, though, when you kind of are maybe seeing someone with a different income bracket. Now, you would think, perhaps, if you see a homeless person in Sherwood Park, that's a little bit of an attention getter, right? But the same is true, kind of flipping it around. I mean, I remember humble upbringing in Northeast Calgary. You'd see some vehicles that were driving around that looked way too nice to be in that neighborhood. Heavily tinted windows, pretty good sound system, and all. Yeah, you'd think, what are these people doing here? Is this a drug dealer or what, right? So it's just a trait of human nature that when you see strangers, you watch more closely. And Peter is telling these people, you guys are strangers, you're going to be watched. And so, with that in mind, he tells them, first, a negative command, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. I like that. And that would have obviously even fit within the times, because self-control was important, of course, for believers. But in that society, with all the good philosophers and such that they had then, the pursuit of virtue would have been something that was prized. And self-control, of course, is a very important part of virtue. But as quickly as he says the negative, he flips around and says more or less the same thing positively. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. Oh man, there's so much I could say here. Live such good lives that though they accuse you of doing wrong, and it happens, people will misunderstand you if you seem strange and out of place. They'll jump to conclusions. Again, maybe an example in our day is Islamophobia. We had some issues with that, not so much breaking the news in the last few months, but I remember it was no more than 2 years ago where there was an incident that happened, and a lot of good people here in Sherwood Park actually went and surrounded our mosque as a sign of solidarity with the Muslim community because they were being singled out and being accused of doing wrong. And well, actually, now that I think about it, we've had some of those kinds of issues happening within Edmonton just in the last few weeks. Some of these things have been making the news because, again, someone looks like a supposed stranger. People watch them and they freak out on them and they accuse them of wrong things. And so Peter here is acknowledging that we're going to sometimes be wrongly accused. More on that later, though, in the letter. But look at that last phrase, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Oh man, there's a lot I could dig out here, perhaps just a few things. Number one, goodness is not a copyrighted exclusive property of Christians. God is at work in the world, and goodness, the goodness of God that he pours out on all people and that all people hunger for in some way is really a work of the Spirit. And so there's a resonance there when people see truly good stuff. You can see, though, that as well, this phrase, it hints at a purpose of the command. This is what many people would call lifestyle evangelism, where based on the goodness that we're trying to live out, we perhaps will change perceptions that people have of Christianity and of Jesus himself. Hoping that, I think our hope and our prayer is that we can make Christ magnetic based on our own actions. And of course, though, at the end of this little phrase, there's another affirmation of Christ's return. Again, remember, Peter keeps his end time stuff pretty simple compared to some other biblical writers. He again is just mentioning the return of Christ. We've seen that already in the letter. This won't be the last time as well. If you want like an Old Testament example for just this banner statement, I would want you to flip over to Jeremiah chapter 29. Now, some of you who know your Bibles well know that Jeremiah 29:11 is the verse in that chapter that gets all the quotes and gets the memes and it gets the nice little, I don't know, little sayings that people put up on their doors and all that kind of stuff about God's plans to prosper us and not to harm us and plans to give us a hope in the future. But not many people know the context of this. This is when the Jews were in exile in Babylon. I love verse 7, where the prophet Jeremiah is basically telling these folks, you're going to be in exile for a while. Don't just kind of wish and pray that you're back in Jerusalem all of a sudden. Instead, he tells them to settle down and marry and have, let their kids marry and kind of settle in there for a bit. And he says in verse 7, also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Again, just a really nice Old Testament example of how to thrive in a setting where they were in exile, Peter's readers were in exile. In a sense, we can kind of understand ourselves in that way too, as foreigners and exiles, in a sense, who should be seeking the peace and the prosperity of our city. Peace and prosperity there isn't far from talking about the goodness aspects that Peter's talking about. So that's the banner statement. Let's get into some of the other specifics. Verses 13 and 14. I'll read those. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. There's that word submit. We'll see it a few times this week and next. This is not about mindless obedience. You can see the important qualifier there is for the Lord's sake. So there's a built-in limitation there. If you can obey this person, submit to them for the Lord's sake, good on you. Sometimes you can't. But it's to every human authority. And of course here there's an emperor level and a local level. We would use different terms in our day, but important to remember that the context back then, there was no choice. I mean, you had to submit. There was no recourse unless you wanted to die. Claudius was probably the emperor here. He wasn't bad as Nero, who would come after him. There wouldn't have necessarily been state-sponsored, widespread persecution that was happening across the empire here, but definitely some little flash or flare-ups here and there and everywhere. In our context, though, things are a little different, right? We live in a democracy. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms here. We do have the ability to peacefully protest and to make appeals for change. And those are good things, actually. They're almost always disruptive, but they kind of show how things are possible. And these kinds of peaceful protests and appeals are not always necessarily seen as evil. So, I mean, for example, Martin Luther King, I think of Rosa Parks and her defiant stand on a bus. I mean, those were disruptive, not violent, but disruptive. In contrast, what happened in downtown Seattle, I think it was last summer, that was violent. It didn't get the public on board. In our context here now, though, I think our attitude about the authorities is important. So as you may have heard, this past Sunday morning, we had a public health inspector show up unannounced to our church before the Sunday service, and they toured things around. It gave me great joy to basically just be able to tell him that our intent was to follow the rules that have been set before us about COVID. And that attitude that I was able to give off to him that way, that was positive, really seemed to be a good thing that made the conversation easy and, I wouldn't say joyful, but easy. And, we passed with flying colors and such. So I think our attitude towards God-given authorities is important. I don't think there's a lot of place in the Christian faith for pure anarchy. No, we believe that God does put authorities in place. Now, if Peter can write this about Claudius, I think we can be saying the same and having the same kind of view, no matter who is in charge of us locally or nationally. All right, let's move along. Verses 15 and 16. I'll read those. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Do you notice that little phrase there again? Doing good. We see it again. There's this concept of the common good. That particular phrase, doing good, I know in the Greek, some different scholars would say that perhaps that could have included thoughts like sponsoring certain kind of civil projects that might benefit all people, paying for a park or for a statue or who knows, right? Maybe. More likely, though, what Peter's after here is not just doing good, but kind of going beyond the expected good. The kind of good that turns people's, kind of heads and attention going, wow, that was kind of above and beyond. And the purpose here, or the hope, is that it would silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Now again, to put it into our context here, I think Christians and churches will be judged, fairly or unfairly, based upon our adherence to public health guidelines right now. If you want an interesting little illustration, right now, go to your mailbox if you haven't done so already. Get your copy of the Sherwood Park News. I've made jokes before, almost nobody reads it, but hey, it's free, it comes to your house. Go to page 7 of the paper and you'll find the letters to the editor. And you should see in there a letter that our local church ministerial wrote to the editor in the Sherwood Park News, in the Tuesday edition. I might not read the whole thing, but if you have it there, no, I probably won't. But you'll take a look at the letter for yourself. This is something drafted up by a number of us as pastors, and we talked it through, and we believed it was just important to put it out there. You'll see in there that we say that we respect and we pray for government officials and healthcare workers and frontline workers. We struggled with it a little bit, but we did contrast a little bit with certain churches elsewhere who have made headlines for dismissing COVID restrictions. We struggled with whether we were throwing people under the bus there or not, but in all honesty, we felt like churches were getting a bit of a bad rap as we were kind of collecting different anecdotal stories from other people. There are people who think lowly of churches because a few are dissenting, and we wanted to kind of set the record straight and show, no, not all of us are. And in that sense, to use Peter's words, we wanted to silence the talk of ignorant people. And again, that's not talking about churches who are dissenting. They have their convictions about it. We'll let them do that. I'm just talking about people who want to piggyback on the situation because that they have a hate on for churches. This gives them ammo, and we wanted to kind of silence that and say, no. Actually, not all churches are acting this way. All right, let's move on to verse 17, our last little bit. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. 4 quick commands that cover most social settings, actually. The first 2 have a potential conflict where you have this, all people and you have the church, and there's sometimes tension between society and the church. And the second 2 sometimes have a little bit of a tension as well, our allegiance to God or our allegiance to the emperor or to the state. And hopefully those things never are in conflict. But these are tensions, and Peter, again, tries to give us general attitudes to approach with all of them, because honestly, character matters with all of them. All right, well, I've been kind of picking on the COVID situation a little bit here, but why don't we broaden it out a little bit? Christians have tried to apply these good words from 1 Peter and other places in Scripture for years upon years. And I came across something in one of the commentaries here that I thought was really helpful. This is from just some distilled thoughts from a very famous pastor and scholar, preacher named Jonathan Edwards, who lived a few hundred years ago in the States. And he basically gives a theology of how we do public life as Christians that I'll just kind of go over them. If you've got some way to write these down, I think this is great. So there's 6 points that he gives. First of all, Christians have a responsibility to society beyond the walls of the church. Of course, many Christians, including some particular denominations or church traditions, will really isolate themselves. But no, we have a responsibility to society beyond the walls of our church. Secondly, Christians should not hesitate to join forces with non-Christians in the public square to work towards common moral goals. Now, again, there's care and consideration you've got to do there, but we don't have the copyright on all goodness, as I was saying earlier. So when we're able to, it's good to partner with others. Number 3, Christians should support their governments, but be ready to criticize them when the occasion demands. Now, again, Paul didn't really talk so much about how to criticize because he was in a social setting where that kind of stuff wasn't even welcomed. It would actually be quite deadly. But for us, supporting the government and affirming them when they get it right, and also being that kind of loyal, I wouldn't say opposition, but being loyal, almost like prophetic kind of roles where we can criticize where we don't think they're doing so great sometimes. Number 4, Christians should remember that politics is comparatively unimportant in the long run. I love that. I think for us, this is, again, remembering the Church of Christ will outlive any one government. The Church of Christ exists well beyond any one particular political system or nation. So in the grand scheme of things, politics is relatively unimportant to the eternal kingdom of God. Number 5, this is something I've preached about before in the summer. Christians should be aware of national pride. Boy, I'm not giving myself enough time to talk about this a whole lot. I have huge concerns when nationalism and religion get stirred up in a pot together. Yes, we can be grateful to God for our country, but we should be very wary of excessive nationalism. And lastly, Christians should care for the poor. Sounds pretty obvious, right? A lot of people care for the poor, not just Christians. But we should be the kind of people that when folks are thinking about who cares for the poor, Christians should be right near the top of that list. That is something I could, again, preach and talk about for a long, long time. But I offer those 6 to you. You might want to just hit the pause button and rewind if you want to can listen to that over and over again. Again, those are 6 points by the famous Jonathan Edwards, who I thought gave some good points there about how we as Christians should be living out our public life. Well, it's about 25 minutes in now, and I'll probably wrap it up here. I'll just kind of ask, hey, what do you think? Did I get it right? If you want to provide any pushback or any questions or any comments, again, all those things are welcome. I'll try and interact with you as best as I can. But next week, we're going to see how this banner statement in verses 11 and 12 apply then to other various social groups. And we'll kind of speed up a little bit next week too. We're going to basically go from verse 18 of chapter 2 well into chapter 3. All right, well, thanks for tuning in today. Hope you've had a good one, and hope that you stay warm this week, and hope that the rest of your week goes well. Blessings on you. Bye-bye.